I'd like to introduce our commissioners, Jenny Potter, Jay Griffin, and Chair Randy Iwase. Thank you for your support of this process and for your participation today. And I invite the commissioners to make any opening remarks if you care to do so.
I'll start. Hi, I'm Jenny Potter. I want to thank all of you for your exceptional work throughout this process, and also our incredible staff who have dedicated so much time in making this a priority for the Commission. But it also has been championed by each one of you in the room, and your participation in preparing the briefs and coming to these workshops and collaborating and really thinking through some tough issues and making recommendations. I was very impressed by the briefs that were prepared, and I read each and every one. And I think that, you know, your contributions to this process are significant. I know that you're dedicating a lot of time and energy, and the Commission really appreciates all of that. I mean, we're embarking on an endeavor that hasn't been done before, and this is important, and we take it seriously, and we're really appreciative of all the effort and energy and time that each one of you as stakeholders are putting into it, and of course, our staff as well. So thank you.
Sure, thank you. First, welcome to our new hearing room and newly renovated offices here. For some of you, it'll feel familiar. We're really excited to be here. I mean, it's an incredible space and look forward to making history here. Also want to thank a number of you in the room who have helped support the Commission in getting the resources necessary to make this happen. It's been a very long process, and again, we're happy to be here. Again, echoing Commissioner Potter's comments, I want to thank all of you more broadly about your contribution so far. We have read carefully all of your briefs. I thought that it was very thoughtful and constructive feedback that we've gotten so far, and we're very appreciative of that, and we're going to build on that moving forward. And so on that note, we're really diving into the key substance of the phase one here in this workshop and the next workshop. So we look forward to your participation today. Our staff has put together a great agenda to help, you know, familiarize all of you with the comprehensive parts of our framework here, as well as help you with the assessment. I just ask that going forward, you, as you formulate your thoughts, bring them forward to the Commission. Be critical, candid, but also constructive in our existing framework. We want to take that feedback and utilize it in our decision making. And with that, again, thank you for your participation here today, and look forward to reading the briefs that you put together.
Thanks, Jay and Jennifer. I want to echo the comments of both Commissioners Potter and Griffin. I want to welcome you to our new, like Jay and Jennifer, to our new hearing room. It still has glitches, so if it gets hot, can't do anything about it. Just keep going ahead. You know, I said at the first the first gathering at YWCA, that and now the work begins. The tough work begins. The briefs have come in. Now comes a time when all of you, on whom we're going to rely for ideas, have to get to work. As I said then, and I repeat now, each of you have a point of view that you believe deeply in. Others may have a point of view that they disagree with you on. I hope that you can work through those disagreements. You know, I'm confident, and we are confident, that you are going to do so. Someone asked me today why I'm like this, I'm not like this, but there is no way to wear my John Lennon tie on an Aloha shirt. So this represents my optimism. It says, imagine all the people, from his song, Imagine. And that's what we're going to do. I think the only person in this room who may have heard John Lennon, because he looks like a fellow traveler from the 60s, is Henry Curtis. But, hi, Henry. He's even got the beard and the long hair, which I don't have. So, but you know, this is an important as well as a historic docket. What we do here will lay a foundation as we move forward so that we can accomplish all that we need to do as we look at all the other dockets that are important to us. We are embarked now on a journey. This is the end, as one person said, this is the end of the beginning. And so we move forward. Again, I hope you can all come resolve a lot of the issues that are going to confront you people. How many of you, by the way, have seen, and I'll close with this, how many of you have seen the movie Clash of the Titans? Has any? Okay, now Henry raised his hand, and so did Jim. I'm sure you remember the old one with Harry Hamlin. Now, we hope that you can come to a resolution so that there is no Clash of the Titans. But if there is, and if it's left to us, we're Perseus. And I want you to know that Perseus was half God and half human. And so the decisions we make, if it's left to us, we're going to do the best that we can. Staff will do the best that it can. But it may not be perfect to each and every one of you. For those who think it's a great decision, you'll say we're like Zeus. And for those who do not, you're going to say we're the human part. So good luck. It is going to require a lot of drilling down, a lot of compromises, a lot of discussion. But, you know, we are confident that with the talent that we have in this room, imagine all the people, what we can do for the state of Hawaii. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you to the Commission. Thank you to Dave for the introductory remarks. If you recall, I'm Dan Crosscall with Rocky Mountain Institute, and we've been invited in service to the Commission and to the parties here to help this process as facilitators for these workshops. So it's great to be back. It's great to be back working with the Commission and staff and all of you for today and to continue this work together. As we get started, I'm curious, just for a show of hands, who was here over at the YWCA in July for our July workshop? Raise your hand if you were here. Okay, great. So a lot of return participants. Now I'm going to put you on the spot. Who is new to this workshop who maybe didn't attend in July? Okay, so we have about 8 or 10 new people participating. Welcome to the PBR proceeding, and we'll welcome them into our work. Then lastly, can I see a show of hands for who is at the July workshop and who's not here today? Great, so everyone came back. That is an endorsement of this process and our facilitation. Thank you for coming back and working with us. We have a full day planned as we do for these events. So I want to start off by providing just some overview of our objectives and our agenda for the day, and then we'll really get going, roll up our sleeves and get going. As you recall, our objectives for the July workshop were around starting this process and in particular reviewing the PBR activities and regulations that are in place in other jurisdictions. And we heard from a set of experts and guests to Hawaii on their experience with PBR in other places. We also used that workshop to get familiar with the process and had some discussion around what the conceptual process is for the PBR proceeding that the Commission and staff have laid out. And the other third objective for that workshop was to begin to consider goals and outcomes for this PBR proceeding. Now today, our objectives for this workshop are threefold. First, we're here to deepen our collective understanding of existing regulatory mechanisms. So in particular, as staff wrote into the staff report that was released last week, we're really having a focus on collectively better understanding the regulations that are in place in Hawaii and how those are serving the set of potential outcomes that may be the focus of ongoing work in this PBR proceeding. We're going to spend some time exploring how those existing structures are or are not achieving those outcomes. And then last, we have a goal that's a little bit less content and regulatory focused, but we really want to use this time to continue to build our capacity to work together and to collaborate in this work, because we are still at the start of this proceeding that will last many months and into next year, certainly. And as we come together in these events to continue to build relationships and our ability to work together as a community. Any questions on these objectives for the day? Okay, so we are using slides today to help with the visibility, but of course, as I click through these slides, they will go away. After this, we have these written on flip charts as well, and we'll flip those down so they'll be visible to us throughout the day. We have a very full agenda for today's work together, where we had a day and a half in July. We're really packing it all into one working day. So we're starting here this morning with the opening remarks that we just heard and this overview of the workshop agenda. And then we're going to spend some time next getting an overview from Carl Friedman on this characterization of existing regulations and the existing framework that is in place in Hawaii to collectively just really dig in and understand these regulations that are in place. We'll take a break. Then we have some remarks from staff about this assessment template that was in the appendix to the staff report. And this is a specific approach that is being offered and encouraged to parties to use in your party briefs to be filed next month. So we'll hear from staff on the thinking and the particular structure and how staff is asking you to use that template. And then we're going to go into some work and into breakout groups to start to get familiar with that template and some of the aspects of it, and really think about how these existing regulations map onto a subset of outcomes. We'll go to lunch. Lunch is planned for 12:30. So 12:30 to 1:30, folks can go out into the neighborhood and get lunch, and then we're asking you to be back in the room at 1:30 to continue this work. And in the afternoon, there'll be an opportunity to share with others in the room your work on that assessment that was done in the morning. So we want to, after the small breakout groups, get to see what others have worked on and understand kind of the bigger picture of how existing regulations are impacting different outcomes. Following that, we have two guests here from the mainland to bring perspectives from the finance and investor community. Michael Weinstein from Credit Suisse and Toby Shea from Moody's have accepted an invitation to speak in this proceeding and share perspectives from the investment community, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions of them. And then, again, we have a series of presentations from some parties to give specific input to the docket for where we are in the process. We'll take another break, and then we have a couple closing activities to do a little bit of work and for individuals to give input on which outcomes you believe are most important for attention going forward. Any questions on the agenda? Okay, it'll be a full day. It'll be busy. We are in a little bit more cramped quarters here, but we'll have those breaks, and our request is just for everyone to participate fully and bring your full self into the work. So the ground rules that we're suggesting for this work today are the same as what we had in July. Two ground rules. First is to be present, and again, this is a request just to, when you're in this room, to be focused and available and participating in the work, and to the best we can, shut out the distractions from our phones and our emails or other things from work and from life, but to really engage in the work. And as you might need to take a phone call or something that comes up, if you can just please step out into the lobby or outside. And then second is to practice democracy of time. So our request and ask is really that everyone respects the number of people that are in the room, and to give everyone the opportunity to participate and weigh in. If you find yourself talking maybe a lot and others are not, that might be an opportunity to quiet and ask someone else maybe what they're thinking or understand a different perspective. And of course, as facilitators, we're going to give a lot of instruction and try to move the group through these conversations in a manner that lets everyone participate. Any questions on those ground rules? I'm going to suggest one additional ground rule, which is an improvement over our July workshop. So we're constantly looking for process improvements in our work, and this is an important one. We're asking that everyone use Sharpies. Those are the black Sharpies that are on your table to write on Post-its or other work that we're doing, and not ballpoint pens. This is really essential in harmonized facilitation work. So I'll write this up. It'll be present on one of these flip charts. The request, there should be enough Sharpies this time. There were not enough in July, but please use Sharpies so that the notes that we use and create through the day are visible. Thank you. With that, I'm going to, I should actually take a moment to introduce my colleagues that are with me, and then I'll pass it to Kara. So I am joined here again by two colleagues from New York City, Kara Goldenberg and Sherry Billamoria. And also we're joined by another RMI colleague, Maddie Tyson. And if you could please take a moment during the day and compliment them on their aloha wear, I think they'd appreciate that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. So to get you all comfortable in interacting and speaking with your fellow attendees today, I want you to turn to a neighbor, introduce yourself if you guys don't already know each other, and answer the following question. What is one exciting development for you since the last workshop? And if you were not at the last workshop, that was about July 23rd, 24th time there. What is one exciting development? Go for it. All right. We're going to ask for a lot of volunteers throughout the day, so thank you. And if you just want to introduce yourself before you speak, that'd be great.
All right, Jim Alberts with Hawaiian Electric. My exciting development is very recent. I just got back from Solar Power International and got to see a lot of new opportunities and investments and technologies that companies are looking at. And when you walk around and look at everybody that's there, almost all of them are very hungry and want to grow. So it was exciting.
Great, thank you. Anybody else, maybe from this side of the room? All right.
Hi, Doug Kodaga, representing Ulupono. Good morning, everybody. I'll share what my co-sherry offered, which was California's 100% renewable mandate as being an exciting development, relevant to what we're doing
All right.
Well, I'm Mark Lowry from Pacific Economics Group. I've been doing some work for the Ontario Energy Board that is interested in learning more about how to benchmark capital spending, which is a very big issue in this proceeding because the law says that there needs to be stronger incentives to contain capex. And we've been particularly studying how they do it in Australia, who perhaps more than any other jurisdiction in the world is really focusing on capabilities to benchmark capex, both, for example, augmentation of the system, which is so often the focus of these Utility of the Future proceedings, as if augmentation capex was a large thing. But actually, replacement capex is usually about 2/3 of all capex. And what do you do to contain that? What do you do to benchmark that? Well, in Australia, they have these complicated models, and not necessarily suitable for Hawaii or anywhere else, but they have developed complicated models to benchmark and give pushback to utilities on their proposed capital expenditures.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. I think we have time for one more. A female? That'd be great. Yep. Okay.
So I don't know if it's an exciting development, but I just, Chris Mays from Arizona State University, and I'm here on behalf of County of Hawaii, and I want to commend the commission again for its work in this area, and HECO as well, for its leadership. I come from a state where, unfortunately, we are having great battles over renewable energy, where the utility, unfortunately, is fighting renewables. So it is, and we have actually a ballot initiative where the people of Arizona are now taking this up and taking it into their own hands. So it's refreshing for me to be able to come to Hawaii, and it's wonderful to see the progress that's being made. And I couldn't agree more as a former commissioner with Chairman Owasi, who said, imagine, I wrote this down, imagine all the people, what we can do for the state of Hawaii. So it's just fantastic to be here.
Great. Thank you. All right. I will turn it over to the PUC staff now for a brief presentation.
So what we're going to do right now for a couple minutes is just provide a quick overview of the phase one process in this proceeding, and then we'll dive into the rest of the workshop. So again, phase one of this proceeding is intended to identify, prioritize regulatory outcomes that warrant further focus and development of individual PBR elements in phase two. So phase one provides the basis or establishes the basis from which we can implement modifications or refinements to the regulatory framework. And the process that the Commission has laid out is shown here on this slide, and we are here in the middle we're at workshop number 2. So workshop number 1, for those who are there, we talked a lot about the goals and outcomes. The staff had suggested a number of goals and outcomes in the staff report, and there was good discussion, discussion among all the participants about those, and that provided the basis to move into workshop 2, which has the objectives that Dan laid out, that deepen the collective understanding of the existing regulatory mechanisms, so we'll talk about those in more detail, explore how the existing regulatory structure it is or is not supporting achievement of the goals and outcomes we talked about in workshop 1, and again, strengthen the capacity of all of us to work together and collaborate. So we provided a staff report in advance of this workshop where we characterized the existing regulatory structure and provided an assessment template that we would invite you to use in your work in assessing the regulatory structure. So after this workshop, parties will be invited to submit briefs to the Commission presenting their assessments of how well the existing regulatory mechanisms are driving achievement of the goals and outcomes that we all have. And we would invite you to begin the process of prioritizing and focusing the goals and outcomes from the list that we discussed last time. We'd suggest that you focus on the top 5 that you have, assess whether the existing regulatory mechanisms are sufficiently driving achievement of those outcomes, and we'd encourage you to cite to data or quantitative information, if at all possible, to support your conclusions. And lastly, I just want to emphasize that this workshop is about generating insights and facilitating dialogue. We're not producing official assessments for the record at this time, and that will come in the briefs and in further steps in the proceeding. Any questions about the process overview or where we are today?
In the staff report leading up to this workshop, you discussed modifications to your list of previous outcomes and goals. You talked about the position of certain parties on different issues. Is there anywhere a summary of what your conclusion is after those changes?
So the staff report is intended to be guidance. Current staff thinking does not represent necessarily the views or the position of the Commission at this time. It was intended to begin the process of focusing and narrowing the range of goals and outcomes that will be considered as we move forward. And when we get to the end of phase 1, the intention is to have the Commission actually establish the goals and outcomes that will be used for phase 2. So that will be the subject of further briefing from the parties.
But you did discuss staff's view on certain things, and you recapitulated a lot of parties thinking about these.
That's right.
So should we be working with the original list or this list as modified by staff in determining the top 5 we've got? I'm just a little confused on that.
It's really up to you, Ron. If you like the list that staff has proposed, please feel free to use that. But we're not intending to limit, your perspective at this time. That's something that you can do and share your thoughts on in the briefs that come here and in further steps in the process.
So you kind of ruled out, for example, beneficial electrification, I think. It sort of dropped out, if I remember correctly. And I'm not proposing we use that one, but is that one fair game for the room, or would be
Yes, of course. So,
ill-advised to use it?
so I think the intention is to help to start to narrow the scope. And so we suggested some outcomes could be consolidated into, together potentially, and then some, clearly rising to the top in terms of priority based on the discussion that we had at the last workshop. So we've suggested that as part of the staff report, but please feel free to propose or to utilize any outcomes that you think are relevant or priority in your briefs. Any other questions? Okay, great. So I think at this time, I'll turn it back to Sherry.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back again. We wanted to take a little bit of time now to share with you a tool for collaboration. I think we call this the 4 ways of talking and listening. And the idea here is that I also have it on this handy flip chart here. The idea here is that when you are in conversation with someone, the way that you are talking, and particularly the way that you are listening, changes what's possible in the conversation, and it changes the outcomes of that conversation. And when you're working towards collaboration, being in dialogue is particularly helpful. And when our attendees or participants in a conversation are participatory and collaborative, the odds that you're going to make meaningful progress increase. So I'll speak a little bit about what each of these quadrants means. The idea of downloading is around giving information. It's around an idea. When Dave was telling us where the emergency exits are, that's not a two-way conversation. That's the communication of a piece of information, downloading it like a file, and you absorb it. There's no dialogue happening there. In a debating mode, it is somewhat what you might expect in a formal debate or otherwise. This is around convincing. You may not actually be listening to the other person in the conversation. You're waiting for them to stop talking so you can begin talking and you can tell them why you are correct and they are wrong. This is about my idea and the communication of my idea to someone else. The next quadrant is what we call reflective dialogue. And this is when you're really seeking understanding. Your goal here is to understand what the other person is trying to communicate to you. What is their perspective? Why have they arrived at the conclusions that they are speaking to you? This is about their idea or your idea, the other person in the conversation. That's your orientation when you're in a reflective dialogue mode. And the last mode is what we call generative dialogue. And this is a space of creation and really about a whole. So what is our idea? What could I, with another person or with these other people, be doing in collaboration, working towards something in the future? What is our idea? And the way that you shift through these modes, the way that these modes are distinct, is in some ways based on how you are talking in a conversation, but even more so, it's about the way that you're listening. So as you are paying attention throughout the day, we invite you to think about the quality of your talking and the quality of your listening in terms of how receptive you are and what your goal in that conversation is. Is it around statements of fact? Is it around communicating your point of view, understanding someone else's point of view, or around generation and collaboration? Are there questions around this phrasing and this concept? Okay. Kara, if I can ask you to actually bring up that flip chart over there. We'll spend a little bit of time now.
What do you call your definition of debating lecturing? Because it is a two-way flow.
That's true. I think of it as you are in some ways paying attention to what the other person is saying, but you're only paying attention from the perspective of trying to then assert why you are correct and why they are wrong. You might be listening for alternative facts or for other things that strengthen your argument. When I'm listening to where the emergency exits are, I'm not then saying, but actually the emergency exits are over here and I think we should be climbing out the windows instead.
I was talking debating.
Yes, I'm illustrating what it would have looked like if downloading were, if we were actually debating about where the emergency exits are. And I think perhaps we're going to move on now. Okay, so I'll invite you now to find a partner, and we'll spend about 10 minutes actually practicing this and paying attention to what it looks like when you're in each of these different modes. I'll cue you to move through these different, I'm not sure if everyone can see this flip chart, but the prompts here are around reading books to take it into a perhaps less contentious and easier to understand topic area, to make it a little bit lighter. So in downloading, the way you might think about it is the last book I read is something. In debating, the best book is. In a reflective dialogue mode, a book you like is. And in a generative dialogue mode, a book we both might like is. So go ahead and take 10 minutes with the person sitting next to you, starting from a downloading point of view. Try that on and see what it feels like to talk about books from a downloading perspective. Thank you very much. So we'll be using, as we did in the last workshop, this norm of getting silence by raising a hand rather than shouting, hopefully. So thank you for participating in that exercise. I'd love to hear from a few people about what you noticed through this and how it might be applicable to our work together.
Mark and I just don't disagree on anything. So, and I think there was a hesitancy to want to even debate each other. So, and maybe that's just sort of a personal thing, but we didn't really want to debate each other and ended up just exchanging ideas on books to read.
Great. Other people on what you noticed, as well as how it might be applicable to our work together.
Well, I noticed that we had this fantastic conversation that had absolutely nothing to do with what we were supposed to be doing, and that if we're going to make progress, we need to pay more attention to the task at hand.
Good words, Carl.
I noticed that listening is intentional, and when I intend on listening better, I get more out of it.
Great, thanks. A few more. And if you might introduce yourself before you make your comment, that'd be helpful. We've got one over here.
Hi, Scott C. Hawaiian Electric. What I noticed, because we, Jessica, Don, and I were doing it, the three of us, and it's easier on the generative dialogue when it's just two, but having to figure out a book that all three of us like is a little bit more challenging. So I think as we get into the bigger groups, we'll just have to understand and have to work through that.
Mm-hmm. We got one last one over here.
I'm going to get my exercise today.
Get those steps in.
Good morning, Ray Tulloch. I think I give Ron the short straw here because he asked me what book I last read, and I couldn't really remember the last book. So, so it
Moreover, you don't like books.
so it made it very challenging for him. But it's part of that is actually changing the nature of the question almost to let him focus on something else. So it's almost diverting the theme towards a slightly different direction. So I've got to apologise to Ron for that. It really threw him a curveball.
Well, we did movies instead.
Great. That was the alternate prompt. Okay. Thank you very much for that. And I also wanted to introduce to you a worksheet that you'll find on your tables based on the 4 ways of talking and listening that you can use through the next presentation. So this worksheet is intended to help you record and share your questions about the presentations. So in sort of a dialogue, a downloading approach, what are the things in the presentation that you just don't understand? What are things that you might disagree with or believe to be wrong? That's the lower right. In the upper right, things that you're seeking to better understand in terms of viewpoint or otherwise. And lastly, things that we might be able to do together on or agree about from the presentation. So we invite you to note your questions or comments in this format through this presentation, and then we will be collecting these worksheets as a source of information and understanding where clarification or points of agreement might exist. I would like you to use a ballpoint pen or an ink pen, but not a Sharpie for this. Thank you for that clarification. You're welcome to put your name on this, but certainly not obligated to. Are there any questions about that? Okay, thank you very much. And now I will turn it, I believe, over to Carl.
All right. So I noticed walking to the back of the room that these screens are a little on the small side, and I think I try to keep the print big, so hopefully it will be legible. I'm going to be doing a presentation. How do I click it? Yeah, okay. I'm going to be presenting on what's Chapter 4 in the staff report, which is a characterization of our existing regulatory framework. And I realized in preparing the contributions to the staff report and preparing for this that this has been a group, these mechanisms are actually owned not just by the commission, but by most of the stakeholders in the group. I mean, my own involvement, I've worn different hats over the whole period that these have been developed. From being an individual stakeholder working for the consumer advocate, I think at one point for Rocky Mountain Institute, our facilitators today, and most recently for the commission. So I'm going to be using the word we, why we did things, and I just want to make sure it's not saying the commission or me, but collectively, all of these mechanisms were formulated with a lot of input from all of the stakeholders here. I'm going to go pretty quickly because I think I recognize most of the people in the room. Everybody's pretty knowledgeable. I'm going to try and, somebody said dig in, and I think mostly this is going to be more of a paintbrush across, and I'm going to pick a few points to really outline, to point out. But most of this is covered in the staff report. I'm not going to try to get into any more detail than that. And so I'm going to go pretty quickly to cover the material. So the material is presented in 4 categories. We have the general rate cases. Each of the Hawaiian Electric companies has a rate case every 3 years, which conveniently for 3 companies works out to 1 a year. Between the rate cases, we have several regulatory adjustment mechanisms that adjust revenues in the interim periods. We have some performance incentives that are particularly focused on utility performance and hitting making changes in revenues. And we have a list that I'm going to go through very briefly that are outlined in the report on the non-revenue regulatory mechanisms we have, which are part of the whole fabric of the incentives we have here that are pertinent to performance-based rate making. I'm going to go through the rate-making process, mostly to map out some of the various elements that we look at in a rate case for purposes of explaining how some of the regulatory adjustment mechanisms work. And in the rate case, we use a test year, and the basic equation is that we try and figure out the revenue requirements that in the typical test year at its expenses, how much it costs the utility to do its business in the test year, a return on the investment, and I've broken out tax separately for the reasons of this exposition. I've broken these out a little bit in detail, not quite the way they get presented in a rate case, but I've broken out fuel and purchase power from the O&M expense and focused the depreciation and amortization as part of the operating expense. And as appendix, I don't have an Olelo slide for this, but appendix C to the staff report, it'd be the last 2 pages, has a breakout of all of these expenditures quantified for each of the HECO companies and for the combined companies. And you don't need to read this, but just you'll see fuel and purchase power, the O&M, depreciation, amortization, along with the taxes, you get the total operating expenses. You can refer to that for all of the quantified versions of all these different rate-making components I'm talking about today. The second component is return on investment, and it's a simple math multiplication. We figure out the rate base, which is the portion of the utility investment that is eligible for recovery from customers, times a percentage return on rate base. That's based on a capital structure. This is pictured here. I'm probably right in the way of some people. This is pictured here. I'm backing away from the equity expert when it's on this slide, you noticed. The capital structure for Hawaiian Electric, primarily long-term debt, about 40%, common equity, 57%. And for each of those, there's a cost rate. And for common equity, we have 9.5% on return on common equity and rate base. And with all that weighted together, 7.5% rate of return on overall rate base. That's after taxes. So what we have to collect in the revenue is amped up by income taxes and taxes on income taxes up to 9.47, about 9.5%. So those are shown for each of the utilities on the attachment C, the capital structure, and the operating income based on the return on rate base. And along with revenue taxes, a test year revenue requirement. So quickly, there's half of a rate case right there. That's the utility facing half that we're probably most interested in looking in PBR. The rest of the rate case has, how are we going to collect that money from customers? And there are some cost of service principles and equity principles, incentive design in terms of how we allocate those costs to different rate classes and come up with rates for energy, demand charges, customer charges. And there you have a rate case. What happens between rate cases? And this is the realm of our revenue adjustment mechanisms and the realm of a lot of what PBR does in terms of how do the incentives line up in what happens between rate cases. So stuff happens. Most pertinent to the collection of revenues, a certain amount of sales, demand, customers, rates are collected. We end up with a certain amount of collected revenues. Now this picture is about the same as I've just stated it now as you would have seen in a NARUC 101 workshop 30 years ago. So nothing I've said so far is anything at all new. This is traditional cost of service rate making. We have a little bit of difference here, maybe. We have adjustment mechanisms. I mean, the overall goal here is we're trying to get the collected revenues to match in some meaningful way this reasonable test year revenue requirement. But some of this stuff is volatile and all over the map. So we have fuel, purchased energy, purchased capacity charges, very variable. In Hawaii, we have a mechanism that passes those through as a straight cost pass-through with some tweaks I'm going to talk about a little later, but primarily a pass-through. And we still have some rubs here, and particularly in order for this to work, for collected revenues to match the test year, you got to come up with the requisite sales and demand and the number of customers to make it match. And in Hawaii, as in many places, we have some state objectives, state goals, which are kind of conflicting with that. We would like the utilities to be ambivalent or maybe excited about energy efficiency, generation on the customer side of the meter, demand response, all of which basically are going to reduce their revenues. And so we have, the collective we, revenue decoupling here, and our version of it is through a revenue balancing account. And basically what we do is we track target revenues. So we define target revenues. We take everything in that revenue requirement that is not otherwise adjusted. So fuel, purchase power, the DSM or IRP, all the clauses. Anything that's not otherwise adjusted and passed through is target revenues. And we have a mechanism that ensures that the company will recover its target revenues no matter what happens with sales, demand, or whatever. It's basically a balancing account. The target revenues get posted every month. Utilities claim it as income. There's no lag. There's no doubt about it. And then as the revenues are balanced against that, we keep a running balance, and at the end of every year, we reconcile that, and we come up with a cents per kilowatt hour adjustment that in the long run should ensure, that ultimately will ensure that collected revenues are equal to target revenues. And you can see in your Exhibit C where you have the test year revenue minus the fuel and purchase power revenue taxes to get the test year target revenue. So at the same time that this was put into effect maybe around 2010-ish, we established a regulatory, a revenue adjustment mechanism, which is basically an attrition mechanism for the period between rate cases, so that for the parts of the revenue requirement that represent some of the fixed costs, O&M, rate base, depreciation, amortization expense, these are basically incremented. The target revenues are incremented in the interim years between the rate cases. We put a RAM cap on that. In other words, the amount that adjustment can affect target revenues is limited to about the rate of inflation on target revenues. And at the same time the RAM cap was implemented, it was acknowledged that the utility needed some kind of interim recovery for large projects that were approved by the commission. So on a case-by-case basis, the commission can allow the capital for large major projects that are individually reviewed by the commission to be folded into target revenues. And what else? Oh, we have a earnings sharing mechanism. This was put in with the original regulatory, the RAM, as a safeguard, just to make sure that the more compensatory system of the RAM was not going to allow the utility earnings to get to be too high. So when the utility earns on an actual recorded basis substantially more than what was allowed to determine revenue requirements in the test year in increasing proportions, there's a credit back to customers for the higher earnings levels. So all of that so far is really cost-based. We have, in addition, some performance incentive mechanisms which are deliberately indexed on some metrics of utility performance. We have several backstop PIMs. These are for reliability and customer service, so SAIDI, SAFE, and call center performance. So these are indices of the frequency and duration of outages. And the reason I'm calling them backstop PIMs is these are not actually targeting to make the utility perform better at these things. They're really kind of a backstop to the sense that to the extent the utility with its capped revenues and its stay-out period, interim period, to the extent the utility can save money and to earnings, can enhance its earnings by reducing costs, we don't want that to happen by cutting short on customer service. So these are kind of backstops. And these are the traditional, it's probably their most traditional original use of performance incentive mechanisms in performance-based rate making historically. We also have some resource procurement performance incentive mechanisms to encourage, let's see, I guess it's demand in the demand response, encourage acquisition of DR contracts with third-party aggregators, and for kind of a shared savings performance incentive mechanism to encourage grid scale renewables and savings, economics of the grid scale renewables. We have some fuel cost adjustment incentives. Now, the fuel cost adjustment mechanism for purchased power, both purchased energy and purchased capacity through the PPAC, these are straight pass-throughs. But on the fuel side, we have an incentive mechanism that rewards the utility for efficient operation of its system. It adjusts for price, but outside of a deadband, the utility basically can do better for itself in earnings if it operates more efficiently or can suffer for inefficient operation of the system. That's been in place for many years. And for the Hawaiian Electric companies, starting in January, there's a risk-sharing mechanism. So instead of 100% pass-through, it will be a 98% pass-through. So that 2% of the variance in energy costs will be a utility risk instead of 100% of that risk being borne by customers. It's ostensibly revenue neutral and unbiased, but the variability, the risk of that variability will, at least to some extent, pass through to the utility. And of course, going back to the attachment C, you can see the test year target revenue and adjusted for each of the utilities by each of these mechanisms to come up with the current effective target revenues. So, summarizing, what is adjusted? And the quick answer to that is everything. But in a little more refinement, I want to go through the individual, I guess, 3 basic flavors of adjustment, I guess you could say. So one is we have straight pass-throughs. Some of the adjustments are based on costs. The actual costs incurred by the utility are passed through to revenues. So that's the fuel and purchase power, the PPAC for the contractual PPA costs, and billing adjustments, DSM, IRP. These things where the actual costs get passed through for the revenues. For the rest of it, because the target revenues are basically the revenue requirement minus those things, we have insured recovery of target revenues. Now that's different than assured recovery of costs, and that's a very important distinction to make in terms of how the incentive works. For the former, for a pass-through, $1 on the margin, $1 earned or $1 saved, has passed straight through to customers. With the target revenues and the rest of it, $1 earned or $1 saved goes to earnings, goes to the utility bottom line. And that's an important distinction to make in terms of how we talk about they're all adjusted, but they're adjusted differently. And the third flavor, so to speak, is the adjustment of the target revenues themselves, the amount that's approved to be collected by the customers is adjusted each year in the interim between rate cases, and then reset and fold it all in the next subsequent rate case. So a couple other things to note. With these, the revenue adjustment mechanism, the RAM, the cap, and the earnings sharing mechanism are all formulaic and pretty automatic. The MPIR is a case-by-case basis allowance for capital costs, maybe operating costs for power plants, or I guess any utility investments between rate cases at the discretion of the Commission, according to some guidelines. And I want to talk a little bit here about lag. So regulatory lag, right? So regarding the first, the actual cost, there's very little regulatory lag. As the costs change, these are passed through monthly to collections and revenues to customers. Regarding the target revenues themselves, there's hardly any lag. Every month, the target revenues, the allowed revenues, are credited to the utilities. They can claim it as income. There's no uncertainty about it. There's no lag about it. They're entitled to it. But the recovery of the revenues that flow through are delayed. It's reconciled. It's a reconciliation process. And so annually, the balance between these two, what they're allowed and what is recovered, is kept in a revenue balancing account. And I think in the staff report I said something I wish I would have said more clearly. I said something about we have this persistent under-collection of the target revenues. And what I was talking about was just the lag between the collection of the revenues. There's no lag in terms of the accrual reporting of income of the target revenues. What's in the balancing account there basically is a utility asset that earns interest, ultimately will be collected, but there's some lag. There's also some lag in the revenue adjustment mechanisms that change the target revenues. They don't happen instantly. It's on an annual process, about a 5-month lag between the RAM year and when they're started. And for the major project interim recovery, it's like within a month. If utility has approval for recovery of capital project, within a month of being in service, those go right into accrual of target revenues immediately. But lag is an important part of incentives, and I just wanted to clarify some of those differences. And those are pretty much the revenue determinants that are listed in the staff report. I want to go through I'm just going to list the non-regulatory elements. I think most of you are familiar with these. I'm not going to describe them. There's a description in the report. We have renewable portfolio standards. We have system planning requirements, competitive bidding framework for new generation. The Commission reviews major CIP, fuel, and PPA contracts prior to those being eligible for recovery and rates. We have a number of rules and standards, including interconnection standards, how the billing for some of the solar programs, net metering, how those work on the customer-facing side. And the utility reviews the accounting and financial affairs, issuance of debt instruments, and we have a third-party energy efficiency provider. So the Commission and that provider are responsible for the energy efficiency portfolio standards. Now, none of these aren't directly affecting the revenue, but they're all kind of the fabric of how we do regulation here that affect some of the incentives we might be talking relevant to PBR. So, where are the existing incentives? And in the short term and in the long term. So in the short term, we talked a little about sales, demand, and customers. In the short term, we have a revenue balancing account, which pretty much should make the utility ambivalent about sales, demand, customer count, weather, just about anything, because the utility is guaranteed that it's going to collect its approved revenues. But in the long term, it's another question. In the long term, the erosion of sales, the demand aspect of the used and usefulness of the existing fleet have all got to be concerns of the utility. And I don't know if you call those incentives or concerns, but they're part of what needs to be contemplated in terms of how we're moving forward. Regarding O&M, it's pretty clear the utility has an incentive to be frugal about its O&M between rate cases. If it saves money between rate cases, it goes to the utility bottom line. And that engine basically is the vintage standard original PBR engine. That's what the original PBR was designed to do. Fix revenues, extend a period, stay out period, and let the utility be frugal and efficient about management and operating its affairs in order to increase its earnings in the meanwhile. And I guess the idea is the next rate case, you want to take all those efficiencies and fold those in. So to some extent, I mean, we've got that going right now. Fuel and purchase power, I mean, the utility right now has incentives to operate its system efficiently. And with the risk sharing mechanism, may be more sensitive to the volatility of its revenues and maybe want to be more strategic about what, you know, in terms of the mix of renewable versus relying on fossil fuels. Regarding rate base, let's see if I can stay out of trouble here. Clearly, rate base is the engine of earnings of the utility. And so utility, and I'll just refer to the literature. I mean, there's a lot of literature about the incentive that utilities have to maintain and increase rate base. Of course, from the customer-facing side or public interest side, you don't want the utility going out and developing rate base unless it's a prudent and something's used and useful and is basically in the public interest. And therein lie some rubs. In a perfect world, you know, with a regulator hat on, in the perfect world, the incentive structure would be set up so that if the utility came in and requested something in rate base, of course it's prudent. I mean, all the incentives would be set up fine. We'd have the perfect PBR mechanism in place that we wouldn't have to worry. But this is part of regulation right now, is questioning as projects come in, are these investments prudent, used, and useful, and in the best public interest? And the other thing I would mention regarding this is in the long run, as we have a lot of the generation is going to be, we anticipate is going to be through purchased power agreements. These can be long-term debt obligations in a sense, or imputed as such. And the utility needs to have some earnings to offset those, to stay good in the books with our debt and credit analysts we're going to hear from later. Enough on that. Rate of return, the utility between rate cases has some incentive to restructure debt, refinance debt to the extent that they can do that economically. That would enhance their earnings prior to the next rate case. The earnings sharing mechanism is kind of works in the other, I mean, this basically dulls the point on the O&M incentives. If the utility is doing really well with earnings, you might get to a point where why save any more, because most of the earnings are going to be returned to the customers. So if you're really going to go all the way with PBR, you know, you might want to think about, you know, why not let the utility just make a lot of money if they're doing just what you want them to do, you know? So that's something to think about. And of course, the existing performance incentive mechanisms are basically targeted at providing incentives. So my last slide here, do we now have PBR? And vintage PBR, I say vintage, maybe it's what Mr. Lowry presented here in 1992, something like that, for Hawaiian Electric. But basically, it was a fixed period race case cycle and capped revenues. The basic concept being with fixed revenues and a long period between rate cases, the utility has incentives to be frugal. That is the concept, basically. And you have some backstop performance incentive mechanisms, as I spoke before, so as the utility doesn't get there by taking shortcuts on reliability or performance. What we have for the HECO companies, we have a 3-year fixed race case cycle. That's not as long as is proposed for some of the PBR. We have decoupled and capped revenues. And we have the backstop performance incentive mechanisms. All of these things in degree. And we also have some fuel and resource procurement incentives, which maybe go beyond the vintage concept and are trying to instill more directly some targeted utility performance. And I guess that's where I got. I hope I've left plenty of time for some dialogue. So,
thank you, Carl.
All right.
I'm gonna try to help with the dialogue. First, everyone in this room, I'm sure, was wrapped to that presentation because this is what we do in our day-to-day work. I hope also at home all the thousands of people across Hawaii watching on Olelo are also still captivated by this presentation. So this is the regulatory soup. This is the stuff that we are here to work on. And in particular, in this workshop, focused on assessing the existing regulatory mechanisms, this is what it is. This is what we're looking at. I want to offer some time for us to ask questions of Carl and have a little bit of discussion in this room to really clarify and understand these mechanisms and how they're working and how they might come to play as we're going forward. So what I'll ask you to do first, I saw a number of people using the worksheet that we provided to note down some things that you think we could do better or things that you did not understand. But why don't we take a few minutes right now? I'm going to ask that everyone puts down at least a question or a comment in one of those quadrants, if not more than one. So we'll take a couple minutes for everyone to write at least one or two things. More is better on these worksheets. Okay, next, in order to identify the most helpful and targeted questions for the whole room to hear, we're going to do an exercise, I believe we also did it in July, in which everyone can share with your table what is the top question you have. So we'll go around, I'm going to ask each table to spend time hearing from each individual. What is the one question that you have? And then from that, I'm going to ask each table to identify one either question that someone wrote or a tweak, a refinement on a question or questions that we can ask of Carl and have a little bit of dialogue in the room. So we'll take some time now. I'm going to give you 5 minutes because these are important conversations, important content. And in fact, Carl does not own all of this information, but the collective experience and work of the people in this room, you have so much to share with each other. So again, the instruction is to hear from everyone at your table in a relatively paced manner, so don't get stuck on one question, but hear from each person, out of which we're going to identify one question per table to share with the room and ask of Carl. So hopefully there's some good discussions and insights just amongst your tables of 8 or so. But now we'd like to hear what are those questions that rise to the top that remain unanswered or could be clarification for everyone to hear. Do I have a table that volunteers to go first? Right here. Is that you, Matt?
Yes. So we've had some very good questions posed here at the table, many of which interrelate, and I've been nominated to try to synthesize and wrap them up into one. So I'll do my best, and apologies to the table if I butcher it. I think there was a question at the highest level around some of the sort of original intent or intent at the time that some of these mechanisms were put into place. Given your institutional knowledge, Carl, and having been a part of these processes over time, and then as related to that, when thinking about the intent, noting that you kind of stress the importance of the distinction between adjustments, cost-based adjustments versus revenue adjustments, and sort of perhaps talking about the import of revenue adjustments not being the same as a kind of cost path-through, and furthermore. How those revenue adjustment mechanisms may have certain lag characteristics. Does that?
It sounds more like a topic than a question.
There's a lot in there. I think if we start with we'll start with the highest level is to the extent that you can. I know it's a very large topic in terms of the intent, but maybe you could focus on the revenue adjustment mechanisms and the target revenues themselves, and speak a little bit to that.
Okay. I guess I'm still struggling to get at a specific question without launching on something that's maybe a little ambitious. But I think certainly when each of these mechanisms was proposed, I mean, most of them were proposed by some party or stakeholder coming into the proceeding. There was some level of dialogue about various aspects of these. And I think cost control certainly was a topic in a lot of these. As an example, the RAM mechanism was proposed jointly by the Consumer Advocate and Hawaiian Electric. And when, I think with some tweaks that kind of evolved over the course of the proceeding, cost control was one of the concerns. And then when we went out to actually implement it, we actually learned more about how the mechanism worked than we perhaps knew. It turned out to be way more complicated in some respects than we thought when we went to implement it. And there were certain aspects of it where cost control definitely was not being, was being an issue. And the commission opened up a reinvestigation of the RBA and RAM. Mostly the RAM was the focus, to look at the extent that some aspects of that mechanism, for example, baseline expenditures, these would be capital expenditures that were not explicitly reviewed as CIP, were automatically folded into the rate base without any review. And it looked like a situation where this looked like, kind of a machine. We saw the amount of baseline expenditures going way up and ended up tweaking that. I mean, we ended up after another proceeding and another set of proposals by parties implemented a RAM cap to try and put a cap on that. Not that that solves it, but it was kind of a, the next level fix. So I tried to pick an example of something. I don't know if it answers your whole topic. But.
So there are a couple questions embedded there, Matt. Is there one other aspect of the second part of your questions that we can address somewhat succinctly, and then we'll go to another table?
I'll do my best. I think both Doug and Mike sort of pointed to your emphasis on the target revenues piece. We'll move away from the intent discussions. I think it was a good example you gave. Could you help unpack that a little bit? Why is it important that when we talk about target revenues and revenue adjustments, we're not talking about the same? Explain the difference a little bit more for us in the distinction between cost adjustments.
Okay, so basically we have the revenue requirement concept developed in the rate case includes all the types of revenues. Some of those revenues are adjusted elsehow. So fuel and purchase power, for example, have their own adjustment mechanism. Purchase capacity cost have their own adjustment mechanism. And if you want to come up with a particular mechanism that adjusts all the rests, you have to come up, what are you going to call that? What are you going to call that? And basically what we did is we came up with a definition of target revenues. It's a creature of the RBA tariff itself, which is you take the test year electric sales revenue, which is almost the same thing as the revenue requirement by $1 or $2 million here, and you subtract from that everything that's adjusted by something else to get the target revenue. And so really the target revenue is just the revenue requirement with everything that's removed, that's adjusted some other way, taken out of it. We also pulled revenue taxes out. I mean, revenue taxes are one of these things that every time you do something, you have to figure out whether it includes or excludes the gross up for revenue taxes. We pulled those out as part of the definition to keep the bookkeeping straight. So I guess the way to understand target revenue, it's a creature of the RBA designed to be everything but what is adjusted by some other mechanism. Did I get that right, Mike?
Yeah, I guess I'd maybe add that it is a periodically adjusted commission-approved target amount.
Yep.
It doesn't adjust monthly or automatically through some other.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because once you see it in terms of that decoupling kind of role, target revenue has also become kind of the grand central station adjustment point for all these other adjustment mechanisms. Right now, what the RBA does is it says, once we establish in the rate case the target revenue, we have this mechanism that is what will be recovered by the utilities, no more, no less. So when we implement these other mechanisms like the RAM and the various PIMs, the MPIR, the way that gets folded into the recovery is by adjusting the target revenue. And so I guess you see the RBA does two things. One, it's a decoupling mechanism, but it also is a way to fold in other adjustments to interim adjustments to revenues. And maybe a third thing, it's a method to reconcile that so that as the actual collections of revenue come in, it tracks those and makes a retroactive adjustment later in cents per kilowatt hour to make sure that all that stuff actually does eventually get collected.
Great, thank you. And thank you for this table for asking a simple question. Appreciate that. Why don't we go to another table? Is there a different question of a different nature perhaps, but just to cover our bases? Chris.
Sure. So we were curious as we were listening to the presentation, Carl, and I don't know if this is possible to do, but it's maybe something we could do, to answer the question, how many of the existing PBR mechanisms or incentives or adjusters directly help HECO customers lower their overall energy bills or directly allow or help advance Hawaii's energy policies? Because I think that's sort of a fundamental threshold, certainly for a county of Hawaii and for other stakeholders. That's why we're here, and fundamentally what we want to accomplish going forward.
Okay. So I guess the first thing I would say is that the performance incentive mechanisms that we went through here are utility facing. So these are basically ways that the performance metrics are how the utility is going to behave and what the utility is going to do, or what revenues are going to be adjusted so the utility is ambivalent towards things. These are all utility-facing things that I presented. Now, in that little right column of the second half of the rate case where we had the rates, and I didn't put much attention to it, are things like rate design. We have various, and we have third-party funding for energy efficiency programs. There are a number of programs, a number of aspects of rate design that are designed to reward or encourage customer behavior, and I didn't put any emphasis on that at all. But I guess I would say to the extent that things like the RBA mechanism make the utility ambivalent to sales, then the utility attitude or inclinations about things like energy efficiency, customer generation, they don't become a conflict for the utility between what they're being told to do by policy and ultimately what their bottom line is. So I'd say that response to that is a little bit indirect, that I don't think the mechanisms I went over today really face the customers directly. They have to do with, I was picking out for purposes of PBR, we were picking out the mechanisms that are on the utility-facing side.
Thank you. I'm going to ask that we go to another table. I want us to move through this discussion and also get to the break. Can you say it in like one sentence? 2 sentences? I'll give you 2 sentences. And I'm going to hold the mic.
The Public Utilities Commission is doing a great job in this proceeding involving groups other than HECO, the utilities, the consumer advocate, and the PUC, because in the past, all these mechanisms were developed in rate cases in which other parties were largely not allowed in.
Thank you. I'm glad I gave you the mic. All right, can we hear from another table with the question you have? I see back here. Great. A lot of tables are putting this on staff to ask the question.
Our question was, why did Hawaii select a 3-year period for the rate case cycle? Why not like 5 years? Why 3 years? And then one observation that we had related to that question was that perhaps the interim adjustment mechanisms impacted that, the existing ones impacted the decision to have a 3-year rate case cycle. So yeah, why 3 years?
Okay, let me answer the first one, and I'll get clarification on the second one. At the time that we established the 3-year cycle, we were not looking in a PBR context so much. I would say the primary thinking was we didn't want a rate case every year, right? And the part of the benefit of the RAM mechanism, which established this cycle, was that we would have some mechanism to extend that out some period. We had 3 companies. There was some thought that by having a regular schedule of each company coming in a year, there was some administrative efficiency that we could, the consumer advocate, the staff, the utility could manage their resources. But I don't think we were thinking primarily in this in a PBR mode of, we certainly weren't trying to figure out the optimal time for a rate plan, a multi-year rate plan at that time. The issue of cost control did come up in the sense that we wanted, that it was raised in the proceeding that by having the 3-year period, there would be some cost control incentive because of the stay out period. But I don't think, the 3-year period was not set based on a kind of proceeding like this, where we're just taking it with the emphasis of what is the right PBR stay out period. The second, what's the second part of your question? The 3-year period was initially set in the original decoupling order, 2008, 0273 or 4, and then implemented for each utility in the next rate case.
Hi, Carl. Just following up on the second point, it was the relationship between the interim adjustment mechanisms and the stay out period and how they're related. We're just trying to clarify that those two probably go hand in hand.
Well, I think the two mechanisms I went over that were formed at the same time as the 3-year period were the RBA and the RAM. And the ones that were associated with that, the earnings sharing mechanism is part of the RAM. The other mechanisms, I think, were considered so far independently, I don't think without a reevaluation of the 3-year period. So the performance incentive mechanisms, for example, some aspects of those are going to get reset in each rate cycle, but some aspects of those don't, they're independent of the rate case cycle. They're not affected by the 3-year period. The targets are set based on like 10-year averages of performance or the past number of quarters of performance and ride through. And the financial incentives are readjusted in the 3-year rate case cycle. But I think these things have developed layered on, and I think the things like the MPIR and the RAM cap, I think we had a 3-year cycle. We're not trying to design a mechanism that can last 8 years. So what's a reasonable type of a mechanism that can last 2 years?
Okay, I'm going to move us forward. I don't want to eat into the break that will come after this. A couple tables have not had your chance to ask a question. I'm going to go in here because it's closer.
Thanks. So our questions largely circled around the subject of the concept that you brought up of lag, and how do you understand, thinking about what is desirable and how to deal with the resultant uncertainty that comes with that. And specifically, we discussed the subject of MPIR as a source of lag and uncertainty.
Okay, so lag, if I could try and define it here, would be the difference. Okay, I don't know how to define it. I have to figure out how to define it. The difference in time between when a cost is incurred or you have a plan addition or the utility would consider itself eligible for recovery and when they actually get that recovery. And that delay can be caused by various things. It can be caused by the process by which things get approved. Do they have to file a docket? Do they need an order? Or is it automatic? And it can be affected by the regular cycling. So now we have some automatic mechanisms like the RAM. They have an annual cycle. And there are some built-in periods where the lag is reduced compared to what it would be in a rate case, but there's still some lag. And with the MPIR as an example of a mechanism where there's very little lag, the utility, in order to get this MPIR recovery, in other words, this is recovery for the cost of a major project, whether it's transmission, generation, that would be put into place in the interim between rate cases. So the RAM already would fold it in, in the next year without the MPIR, but it would be subject to the RAM cap. If they come in with MPIR, they can go above the RAM cap, but also once it's decided that the unit is eligible, the month after it's in service, the utility immediately starts to accrue recovery. And in the next following year, they start to get the depreciation amortization portion of that. So there's very little lag associated with the MPIR compared with the RAM or with the rate case.
Okay, thanks. Last couple questions from this side of the room. Mike Florio.
Okay. We had a clarifying question here. I don't know if you want to take it, but. Okay, move on.
Okay. I had a question about how the incentives differ within a rate case cycle versus over multiple cycles. It seems as if the length of the cycle creates certain incentives that then by and large disappear in the next rate case cycle and others may take over. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly some of these incentives, like the basic PBR, vintage PBR incentive, where the whole idea is that you have some extended period of time between rate cases for the utility to take all these things it could do to make itself more lean and mean and efficient, kind of get some of the benefits you'd have if you were in a competitive environment where a dollar saved is a dollar earned, and get into that mindset. Rather than if you have a rate case every year, it's like a dollar saved as well, that's another dollar you don't get to have in the next year's revenue requirement, or a dollar of cost you're going to get recovered right away. So the length of the time definitely is a large factor in terms of how effective that basic fundamental stay out under a revenue cap strategy is going to work. I don't know if there's another aspect to your question.
Longer-term incentive. Longer-term incentives that the company might have over multiple rate cases.
Oh yeah. Okay. So things like sales, for example. The RBA mechanism, I think, does a very effective job at making the utility ambivalent to sales and revenue, demand determinants in the short term. But that does not mean that the erosion of sales is not a very poignant and important decision in the boardroom. And so the longer the stay-out period is with that, I don't know if the stay-out period affects that per se, but there's certainly a difference between the short 3-year kind of cycle we have and the immediate revenue recovery type mechanisms and some of these long-terms. Long-term things, development of rate base, this affects the value of the company. It affects the earnings, and the sales is definitely a part. So I think in the long term, I think the relationship between the sales and long-term earnings are going to be multi-rate case issues that maybe aren't addressed by any of our existing mechanisms.
Great, thank you. And last table, here we are.
I could, I won't. We had various questions, but the one that floated to the top was we were wondering if we could get more clarity on how much the utility target revenues and return of and on rate base relate to various utility functions. I think most prominently generation versus T&D. And even going as far as could we get an addition to Appendix C, sort of breaking those out that way.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure. So you talked about how the return on equity might affect the difference between investments in transmission or generation. Is that?
No, more generally, just how do the numbers look like in terms of, I mean, so for example, the Appendix C here breaks down the various expenses, right?
Yes.
But generally, production, which may be, I guess, generation, transmission, distribution, et cetera, and then there's depreciation and amortization under O&M expense, you know, in all these expense categories. We thought it might be insightful to group the various costs under the utility generation function versus the utility, you know, delivery function.
Okay, so in order to produce Appendix C, I looked at the results in operations. These are the standard NARUC account approach of summarizing these things. But in each of the rate cases, you have more different cross sections of these things than you might ever want to have. But I mean, these are broken down by individual process areas. So you have the production, energy, what is it? Energy supply, energy power supply. You have energy distribution. All of these numbers are broken down different ways in the rate case filings, and those are accessible. Those are all posted, you know, and you'd have to look, I would say you'd look at the rate case exhibits. I don't know that we're going to be able to produce that kind of thing, but it's easy to find if you need it.
I guess embedded in that question is that might provide some insight onto utility incentives as well, how those costs sort of line up.
Okay, thank you. So we've put a lot on the table here. So, grist for the mill as we continue in today's work and then in the weeks and months ahead. But thank you, Carl, for endeavoring to provide that review of the existing framework. So we're going to take a brief break here in just a moment. But before you do, the request is if the staff persons that I think are at just about every table could collect the worksheets and collect those from each table, and then we'll bring those back maybe over to the RMI team. So we'll have that record and be able to review any questions that did not get voiced publicly.